right, thank you. I'm not he, but Earl Scruggs invented the bluegrass style of banjo playing, and he himself referred to it as Scruggs style. He grew up in North Carolina, rural North Carolina, near Shelby, North Carolina, a place called Flint Hill, and he grew up on a farm, and he played in the three-finger style. He would plant his ring in pinkies, and this January 6th, this past January 6th would have been his 100th birthday. He was born in 1924, and he would plant these two fingers then, pick with these three fingers with finger picks on the end so it can be louder and louder than any of the other instruments in the bluegrass band. And some of you might have heard of a tune called The Ballad of Jed Clampett, which was on television. Even some of you younger folks, it's still in repeats, I'm sure. And it goes like this. And that's how a lot of people got turned on to bluegrass and the banjo, a guy named Bela Fleck. How many of you have heard of Bela Fleck? Oh, right, great. And he was a young guy, like maybe 15 years old in New York City, and heard that and went, oh, I gotta play the banjo. And so that was a very influential tune. But anyway, Earl Scruggs went to join Bill Monroe in 1945. October of 1945, he auditioned for Bill Monroe with a terrible case of the flu, and Bill Monroe was 3 hours short of, 3 hours late of being there for the audition, and the person that drove Earl to the audition, and Earl was feeling pretty peaked, had to get back to Knoxville, so Earl was going to take a bus back. So finally Bill Monroe shows up, and Earl plays a tune called Sally Gooden. Which goes like that, and got the gig to play with Bill Monroe. And all Earl wanted to do was get on the bus and head back to Knoxville because he was feeling so sick. And Bill said, oh, I want you to play with the Bluegrass Boys, play with the band so I can see, how you fit in with the band. And Earl went, okay, so he plays for another hour or two with the band, and then says, I gotta catch this 11 o'clock bus tonight back to Knoxville, or I'm gonna just die. So Bill said, okay, well, I'm gonna pay your bus fare, you tell me how much it was. And so Earl gets on the bus, it's packed, there are no seats on the bus, and Earl has to stand or sit in the aisle all the way back to Knoxville, which he arrived there at 7 in the morning, so all night. And Bill Monroe never sent the $7 for the bus fare, as the story goes. So poor Earl, but Earl changed music history and bluegrass history by being in Bill's band, and they used to introduce on the Grand Ole Opry their acetates of recordings of Bill Monroe with Earl Scruggs in the band from 1946 and 47, and the announcer, old Judge Hay, would say, and this is Bill Monroe's band, and old Judge Hay would say, now here's Earl Scruggs with that fancy banjo picking. Now Earl, you get Brother Bill and let's go. This is Bill Monroe's band, so anyway. And I could go on for about 3 days and you guys would be trapped here, and I could talk about Earl Scruggs about that long. But I'll play the tune that really kind of put him on the map. When you played with a band leader in the 40s, you might write a tune and the band leader would say, I wrote that tune, and then get all the money for it, which is what Bill Monroe did. Earl Scruggs wrote a tune called Bluegrass Breakdown, which went. Went to an F chord there. And so Bill Monroe said, I wrote that, and got the royalties for it. So Earl Scruggs turned around and wrote a tune that goes like this. Called Foggy Mountain Breakdown, and made a lot more money than Bill Monroe made off of Bluegrass Breakdown, so Bill got his just desserts. Anyway, again, I could go on for a long time. One of the great things that Earl Scruggs said, one of his great quotes was, because he was very forward thinking for his time, coming out of Nashville, and in later years he ended up playing with his sons, and this is like in the early 70s, and had a group called the Earl Scruggs Review, And they did a film on Earl Scruggs where he was playing with various people like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. And he was supposed, how many of you have heard of Ravi Shankar? Ravi Shankar played sitar, an Indian musician from India. And it was a very unlikely pairing to have Earl Scruggs and Ravi Shankar playing together. And so they wanted to film Ravi Shankar playing with Earl Scruggs, except they couldn't find a film crew, but Ravi Shankar showed up anyway, and they jammed for a while. And then Earl said, Ravi, what would you like to have for lunch? And Ravi said, Kentucky Fried Chicken. So they had some Kentucky Fried Chicken and went on their ways. But Earl had this great quote where he said, "You can't encore the past. When I see a bright light shining, I move toward it." Meaning you can't repeat the past. He always wanted to come up with new ideas and new things, and which he did. So anyway.
Question back there? Do you have a question, Sarah?
Oh,
Yes.
I was just wondering how you were introduced, or how you got into the bluegrass style versus clown or different kind of style. Why did
Well,
you choose it?
yeah, during the, as we refer to it as the folk scare of the late 50s and early 60s, I grew up in Syracuse, New York. Well, yeah, I don't have to say, you know where Syracuse is. I lived there for many tawdry years. Anyway, and I heard my very first album was by a group called the Kingston Trio, which most of you probably never heard of, but they were a folk group, and they had a song called MTA, and there was a banjo solo on there that went. And these 16 notes. That was such a cool sound, I had to play the banjo. So I was already playing guitar, but when I heard that, and I didn't know from Clawhammer, I just knew that really obnoxious, loud, banging sound was what I wanted to do, so it ruined my damn life. That's how I got into it, yeah. Another question? Yes?
Not to expand too long, but how does Ralph Stanley fit into bluegrass picture?
Ralph Stanley came after Earl Scruggs. A guy named Ralph Stanley was in a group with his brother Carter Stanley, and they called themselves the Stanley Brothers, which I don't know how they came up with that name. And they grew up in Southwest Virginia, and had kind of a hard scrabble life, and they have more of an old time. They almost combine old time and bluegrass in their music. And Ralph Stanley was a wonderful banjo player. Their very early recordings where he's playing in almost a two-finger style, and then he glommed onto what Earl Scruggs did and came up with a tune called Clinch Mountain Backstep. Crazy ending for this really lonesome tune. And he has this very, really cheering ending. And what the Stanley Brothers would do, they would be on the same bill with Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, and they'd be in adjoining dressing rooms, and either Carter or Ralph Stanley would put a glass up to the wall to hear what Bill Monroe was rehearsing for their set, and then they would learn that song, and then they would go on stage before Bill Monroe would play tunes from his set. So it was a very competitive sort of thing back in those days, which isn't true in old-time music, is it?
It's different.
Why don't you talk about old-time music for a little bit? It's a small topic, I know.
Small topic. Well, the same group that Tony mentioned earlier, the New Lost City Ramblers, were part of the reason that I discovered the music as well, except that I kind of went in the direction of the older stuff, but the beauty part about Tom Paley and John Cohen and Mike Seeger, who were the New Lost City Ramblers, was that they recognized that, you know, in modern times, the way we are in society, we really define ourselves into kind of narrow kind of wedges. You know, I remember when we originally went to FM radio, and I'm showing my age here. On AM radio, you used to hear a little bit of everything on every station, and you were exposed to things, and that's how I discovered folk music. But when FM came in, all of a sudden you had radio stations that only played Stravinsky, that only played bad light jazz, that only played the Beatles. And so you weren't exposed to anything anymore. But the New Lost City Ramblers, they took everything in from tradition, blues, gospel, you know, what we call, the musicologists call social music, music played in people's communities. And they made it one thing. You know, if you talk to Ralph Stanley or even Bill Monroe, those guys, they may have invented a style, but I bet you they would have told you they were old-time musicians as much as anything. This was their roots. But that was the stuff that grabbed me, and for me it was a kind of a social thing. I grew up in the South, Bronx. And it was, the music was just kind of, it was everywhere, and there was a group of people that met every week, played jam sessions, and that became my social scene. So I play music as much for the social aspect of it as anything. It just happened to be a language that I had no cultural claim to, that just kind of bit me in the right place, and I've been playing it ever since. And then you know, when you get into something, the history of something, and then you discover that there's no such thing as a new idea. Everything comes from somewhere. And all these old-time tunes come from melodies that might have been across the water, Ireland, Scotland, West Africa, which is really the roots of the clarinet banjo. And everything is an evolution. That's kind of the beauty part of this for me. And to me, old-time music is part of the evolution into bluegrass. And there's not one hard defining line between the two. One flows into the other, which is why I think we can play the same tunes together.
Yeah.
But let me play you something, just to give you an example. This banjo was made by a guy named Kyle Creed. Kyle Creed was a great player and a really interesting banjo maker from the Blue Ridge. But this instrument is closer to its African predecessor. If you've ever listened to any Ngomi or Holland, any of the West African instruments, a konting, they're all skins stretched over some kind of hoop. And some of them have one short string, some have two short strings. There's all different configurations of it. But the thing that came across the water and popularized in minstrel music, and if you want a really good book to fall asleep to at night, read Dan Emmett and the Rise of Negro Minstrelsy, which is a documentation of how the instrument that came over with the slaves worked its way into American culture and developed into the minstrel movement. A lot of that music is the basis for how the American banjo style kind of evolved. And so I'll just play you a dance tune.
And notice the tuning also, instead of standard G tuning, you're in a different tuning.
This is in what we call a double D, but it's D, A, D, E, and the thumb string is A. So there are many banjo tunings in the old-time style, probably not as many in bluegrass. You tend to play
There
a
may
lot.
be three, literally, in bluegrass.
Well, there's a website that a woman put up a few years ago. It has something like 125 banjo tunings on it. Some of them are pretty good. Anyway, I learned this tune from a guy named Clyde Davenport. He was a great fiddler and banjo player from Kentucky. We used to call him Clyde the Glide. This is 5 miles from